Okay, guys, we're going to pick up on chapter 21. This is on page 59 in the PDF. You want to follow along. Chapter 21. Kuba lifted the newspaper. He's dead. Kaput, says Enos. We were standing in the snow around the body of John. I wasn't sure how they could tell. John was no grayer, no more silent than usual. Other people walked away, not looking. Shoes, said Ferdy. John had fine shoes, like the rest of us, except Big Henrik. When one pair wore out, we stole another. Somebody will take them, said Enos. But it's John, said Oleg. He meant to point at John, but only his shoulder moved forward. Sometimes Oleg forgot his right arm was gone. Give them to Big Henrik, Yuri's voice. He hadn't been there a moment ago. Big Henrik doesn't like shoes, I said. This was true. Even before the ghetto, even before the jackboots came, Big Henrik wore gray bank coin bags on his feet, even in the snow. They were tied at his ankles with drawstrings. They won't fit, said Ferdy. I couldn't tell if Ferdy's cloud breath was from the cold or his cigar. Big Henrik had little feet, said Yuri. Take them off. Kuba pulled off John's shoes. Yuri wiped away the snow with his foot. He made Big Henrik sit on the curb. He pulled off Big Henrik's bank bags. He put John's shoes on Big Henrik and tied them tight. Big Henrik stomped his feet like a baby. He let out a loud squawk. Yuri grabbed Big Henrik's ears and twisted. I thought he was going to twist them off. Big Henrik's eyes bugged out. Using the ears as handles, Yuri hauled Big Henrik to his feet. He left Big Henrik squawk some more and then said to him, Are you going to wear the shoes? Big Henrik nodded sharply. Yuri let go. As they were walking away, I said to Yuri, Will an angel come for John? This is what I thought I heard under the braided rug, that when you die, the angel carries you off to a place called heaven. Enos, overhearing, sneered. Yeah, here comes the angel. It was a horse, so skinny it seemed made of sticks and paper bags, clopping through the snow and slush of the street. It was led by two begrangled men, and it pulled a wagon with a dead and naked body on it. We looked back. The horse stopped at John. One of the men grabbed John by the feet and pulled him onto the wagon. The other man grabbed John by his armpits, and together they swung him back and forth. It reminded me of the girl orphans jumping rope. Suddenly, they let go of John, and he sailed through the air on top of the other body. The wagon rolled on. Where were they taking him? I said. Where do you think? Said Enos. Off to heaven he goes. I believed him. What happens there? I said. Kuba laughed. He becomes a jackboot. Others laughed loudly, even Yuri. I was confused. But he's dead. Not anymore, said Ferdy. Nobody is dead in heaven. Right, Yuri? Said Kuba. Everyone looked at Yuri. Yuri said nothing. They pumped the air back and forth. As good as new, said Kuba. More laughter. Enos raised his fist. Let's hear it for heaven. Everyone cheered but Yuri, even Big Henrik. And when they were silent for a long time, the only sound came from Big Henrik trying out his new shoes, clopping them like a horse into the slush and snow. When he splattered the ankles of other people, they gave us ugly looks. Someone gave us more than that, a flop. Flops were all over the place. The jackboots hired them to guard the Jews in the ghetto. The crazy thing was, the flops were Jews too. Jews guarding Jews. It made no sense to me. Flops were not allowed to carry guns, but each had a whistle and a wooden club as long as my arm. They wore uniforms, but they fit no better than our clothes. No high boots, no silver eagles. And of course, being Jews, they wore armbands. So this flop came along and began to yell, shaking his club, Armbands, armbands! As always at times like that, we scattered like cockroaches. But this time one of us got caught, Big Henrik. Big Henrik was clopping away at his new shoes and did not notice anything else until the flop had him by the arm. I heard a bellow and stopped to look back. Big Henrik was standing in front of the flop, holding his head with both hands as the flop screamed at him and waved the club in his face. The flop was short and scrawny. He had to look up at Big Henrik as he screamed at him. Then I saw a flash of red hair. It was Yuri coming up from behind the flop. He grabbed the club and pulled the flop over backwards to the sidewalk. By now, the rest of the people were on the other side of the street, pretending they didn't see. Now the club was in Yuri's hand, and Big Henrik was just standing there watching. And that was when Yuri conked the flop on top of his head, just like that. Thok, like the sounds in the lineup. Now it was the flop holding his head, wobbling about the sidewalk. This must have tickled Big Henrik, for he took the big club from Yuri and bopped himself on the head. That must have tickled the rest of us, for suddenly we were all dashing out of the shadows, passing the club around, bopping ourselves in the head just hard enough to be fun and send us lurching around the wobbling flop. Then the flop lost his balance and toppled to the ground. We got other notions. We pulled off his shoes and flung them into the street, and all the people on the other side suddenly had eyes and dove for the shoes. Then the flop's jacket went flying, then his pants. "Take his feet," Yuri said to Enos, and Enos took his feet and Yuri took his arms, and I was having too much fun to think, "Yuri, you're not being invisible." They swung him like a jump rope, like the wagon men had swung dead John, and let him fly, and the flop went sailing through the air, landing in a slushy splash. Yuri wound up, flung on the club far into the rubble, and the flop groaned in the snow in his underwear, and once again there was no eyes on the other side of the street. Chapter 22. "Here comes the big shot," said grim-faced Enos. "The new Jew," said Kuba the clown. "The family man," said Ferdy, his cigar flapped in his mouth as he spoke. "The littlest Jew," said Enos. "We are honored by your presence." He stood and bowed to me. Yuri smiled. I no longer slept all the time with the boys. Sometimes, over Uncle Shepsel's objections, I slept at the Milgrams. When I returned to sleep with the boys, they ribbed me. There were mountains of rubble to climb over to reach the braided rug. We slept on top of it now. It was spring. From the moment Mr. Milgram said, "He is now," my identity as a gypsy vanished. Gone were the 7 wagons, 7 brothers, 5 sisters, Greta the speckled mare. Deep down, I guess I'd always known my gypsy history was merely Yuri's story, not reality. I didn't miss it. When you own something, it's easy to let things go. When you own nothing, it's easy to let things go. I suppose my last name was Milgram now, so Pilduski went too. I kept Misha. I liked it. I kept something else also, the yellow stone around my neck. The yellow stone my father had given me. I knew, as something in me had always known, that there was one true part of Yuri's story. We lunged on the rug, our backs, our hands behind our heads, taking it easy, enjoying the mild air, watching the stars fade. Soon there was only the moon and 1 star. A smear of a robin's egg blue showed beyond the rubble. Day was coming. We were night people now. We were all smugglers now, even Big Henrik. Smuggling was the nighttime thing. Ferdy passed around his cigar. We took turns puffing and coughing. The stars were fuzzy beyond the cigar smoke. "Himmler's coming." These words were followed by the silence of surprise as they were spoken by Big Henrik, who often bellowed like a cow but hardly ever bellowed words. At last Enos said, "Himmler? The Himmler?" "Himmler coming," Big Henrik repeated. "I don't believe it," said Enos. "Why is he coming?" said One-Arm Oleg. Enos asked Yuri, "What do you think?" Yuri had a cigar. He blew a stream of smoke at the stars. "I think Himmler can go anywhere he wants." "Who's Himmler?" I said. Enos laughed. "Just the number 2 jackboot, that's all," said Kuba, who had taken a seat on a pile of bricks. "You can thank Himmler for this wonderful bedroom," said Enos, "and for the growl in your stomach, and the bodies in the street, and the wall." "Himmler, Shimler," said Kuba. "We're as good as dead," said Enos. "Himmler's coming," bellowed Big Henrik. The sun came up and we went to sleep. We woke at noon and scattered. I looked for Himmler everywhere. I didn't see him. I was disappointed. I wanted to get a look at the number 2 jackboot. I had heard a man called Hitler, who was the boss of all the jackboots, who also were called Nazis. But it was Himmler, Enos said, who was in charge of the ghetto, in charge of the Jews, in charge of us. I usually brought food to the Milgrams. This time it was news. "Himmler's coming," I announced. After giving me this greeting, "Ah, the smelly intruder," Uncle Shepser looked at me and said, "Where's the food?" Mr. Milgram was lancing a boil on his wife's leg. "A little gratitude would be nice." "I hate Himmler," said Janina. She was playing pickup sticks on the floor. She had brought them from the old house. Don't you want to see him? I said. If I see him, she said, I'm going to go right up and kick him. To show me, she stood up and kicked the leg of the table. Who says he's coming? Said Uncle Shepsel. Big Henrik, I said. He's big, I said. He didn't used to wear shoes. Now he wears dead Johns. I'll stop there, said Uncle Shepsel. Are you going for food? Not now, I said. I'm hungry now. Mr. Milgram snapped. Shepsel. Uncle Shepsel slunk back in his usual corner. Mr. Milgram finished with a boil and pulled Miss Milgram up to the sitting position, her back against the wall. She had become skinny and gray. She no longer worked at the uniform factory. She tilted to one side. Her hair was like a mop. She looked like a rag doll I had seen at Dr. Skorzik's orphan girls carry. She coughed. At the force of the cough, she toppled over. Mr. Milgram straightened her up again. He pushed himself to his feet. He shuffled across the room to me. I knew he was going to talk to me. He seemed to feel that he had been so close to me in order to speak, and he never spoke without touching me. Sometimes he laid his hand on my head. Sometimes he ran his fingertip across my shoulder. He did this with Janina too, and he always smiled when he spoke to us. You're a good boy, he said. I was sure he was about to praise me more, but Janina interrupted. Am I a good girl? She said, pressing up to his leg. He laid his other hand on her head. You are both good. You are the best children. But who's better? Said Janina. Misha or me? Mr. Milgram looked down at us. His smile seemed to double, so we both would have a full share. He pretended to give the question great thought. No one is better, he said at last. It's a tie. Janina stomped her foot. Ta-ta, it can't be a tie. Somebody has to be better. Who says? Said her father. Ta-ta, I beat Misha all the time when we race. This was a lie. I was always the one who won. Janina lied a lot. And I'm better at pickup sticks. True. And look, she did a split. And look, she attempted a headstand. For a few seconds, her feet hung in the air inches above the floor. Her shoes were caked with spring mud, crusty and torn. The shoes came back down. She stood proudly. See, in her mind, she had done a magnificent feat. I can do that for a whole hour if I want to. Mr. Milgram nodded. Very impressive. It's still a tie. Janina stomped. She squealed. Mr. Milgram raised his finger. She stopped squealing. She started again when his finger went down. He raised it again. She stopped. But Tata, you said I'm wonderful. Remember you said that? I remember, he said, and I meant it. Janina stuck out her tongue at me. I'm wonderful. And so is he, said Mr. Milgram. But I'm more wonderful, right, Tata? You are both equally wonderful, said Mr. Milgram. You are each wonderful in your own way. What way am I wonderful, Tata? He sat down with a sigh in his only chair. He was always tired. He was no longer smiling, and yet it felt somehow as if he was. You, he pressed the tip of her nose with his finger, are girl wonderful, and he is boy wonderful. Janina looked at me. She was the only person I knew who had to look up at me. She studied me. She turned back to her father. But girl wonderful is better than boy wonderful. Yes, Tata? Mr. Milgram slumped in the chair. He wagged his head. He turned Janina around by her shoulders and gave her a gentle pat on the backside. Go play pick-up sticks with Misha, he said. We had just sat down, cross-legged on the floor, the pick-up sticks between us, when we heard voices in the courtyard. I couldn't make out what they were saying. I went to the window and leaned out. Now I could hear. Himmler's coming. Chapter 23. Janina was screaming as I raced down the steps to the courtyard in the street. She wanted to kick Himmler, and it took both her father and Uncle Shepsel to hold her back. I careened from person to person. Where's Himmler? Where's Himmler? I followed pointing fingers down one street and another until I saw the cars coming, a parade of them. Huge cars, magnificent cars, with the tops down. The cars had uniforms of their own. They were gray and silver and unsmiling and proud, like the man sitting in them. Peddlers' carts veered out of the way. I was surprised that people were not pouring out of the buildings, mobbing the sidewalks. A few people stood at the curb, hats in hand, looking down. Others kept walking along, even straight ahead. Such was a man whose sleeve I tugged Which one is Himmler? The man kept moving as I wasn't there. Only the flops looked at the parade. They stood at attention with one arm out thrust in the They stood at attention with one arm out thrust in the jackboot salute, as if reaching for something no one else could see. A corner of newspaper over a nearby corpse waved in the breeze. I began to panic. I grabbed at people. Which one is Himmler? No one would answer. I trotted along with cars. I stared at the magnificent men. They stared straight ahead. On the jackboot's hat, the great silver eagles spread their wings and seemed to glare at people, daring them to do something wrong. Their wings were like angels' wings, except the eagle's wings were fully unfurled, flying. I began calling to the men in the cars. Are you Herr Himmler? Some of the men looked down at me. No one answered. I ran from car to car. Are you Herr Himmler? I saw a man, the most magnificent jackboot I'd ever seen, sitting in the back seat of the first car. It must be him. His ramrod attention was better than my own in the courtyard, and he was only sitting. Blonde hair curled from beneath his eagle-winged hat. His head looked as if it had been chiseled from stone. His jawbone was all the weapon he could have ever needed. Herr Himmler, I shouted. Herr Himmler. He did not move. Someone else did. The jackboot in the passenger side of the front seat turned his head slightly, enough so that one of his eyes stared at me for a moment. The eye seemed too large, as it was magnificent behind the thick, round lenses of his eyeglasses. The only thing magnificent about the man was his uniform. I saw a half-little black mustache. It seemed to be dripping out of his nostril, a scrawny neck, a head that seemed more dumpling than stone. Can this be Himmler, the number 2 jackboot? He couldn't be. He looked like Uncle Shepsel. I knew how to prove it one way or the other. His boots. Surely on his feet, the feet of Himmler, the master of all the Jews, would be the most magnificent boots of all. Maybe they went all the way up his legs. Maybe they had silver eagles. The parade was picking up speed. I ran to keep up. Herr, sir, let me see your boots. Herr, sir. And suddenly I was on the ground. I had run smack into someone. As I got to my feet, a club was swinging back and forth before my eyes. I heard a loud smacking kiss. There was an overpowering smell of mint. Beyond the swinging club, the parade rolled through an open gate in the wall and was gone. I knew who was on the other end of the club. I looked up. It was Bufo. Bufo, the worst flop of all. He was the only one I was really afraid of. We all were. No one knew how to account for an existence like Bufo's. It did not seem like he could possibly be a Jew, but he wasn't a jackboot either. We boys decided to believe he was a Warsaw sausage maker. He looked like a pile of fat sausages who hated Jews so much he pretended to be one so that he could live in the ghetto. Then he could become a flop and torment Jews to his heart's content. Like all flops, Bufo was not allowed to carry a gun, but that made no difference to him. He would not have shot anyone if he could. He carried only his club. It was said that he loved the sound of clubs cracking open a skull like a pumpkin, but this was not true. He hardly ever used his club. His real weapons were his hands. More than anything, he loved killing Jews with his hands, and not just any Jews, Jewish children. If you were an adult Jew, he would walk right past you, but he went out of his way for children. Sometimes he left the streets and waddled through the alleyways and rubble, smacking his club on his thigh, hunting. When he spotted someone to go after, he kissed the club. Fortunately, he was fat and slow. If he managed to catch you or trick you, he used the club to stun you. Then he jammed it into his belt and wagged his finger for the treat to come. He always smelled of mint, not from chewing gum or candy, from mint leaves. He chewed them like men chew tobacco. There were always tiny flecks of mint on his lips. If you could see them, and if you could smell the mint, you knew you were too close. In fact, that was how we came to say a child was killed by Bufo. He smelled the mint. His favorite way to kill you was to put your face first in his bottomless belly and smother you. When this happened, the odor of mint hovered above the body until the wagon cart took it away. I think Bufo hated me most of all. I was the only one who had ever got close enough to smell the mint and lived to tell of it. Though he terrified me, I pestered him. I couldn't help myself. I called him Fat Man. I had no sense. If I had had sense, I would have known what all the other children knew. The best defense against Bufo was invisibility. Never let him see you. Me, if I saw him waddling down the street, I would sneak up behind him and yell, "Fat Man!" He would be fuming as he turned around, and he recognized my voice, his personal gnat, and the club would already be swinging as I was ducking out of the way. "Your ears are hairy," I would shout in the thumb of my nose at him and scoot away into the crowd. And now there he was, looming above me, smiling and kissing his club, and that was giving me all the time I needed to get away, but I couldn't. He had my foot pinned to the ground in his boot, a scuffed, mud-caked, un-Jack-like boot. I screamed in pain. He laughed. The club chattered to the street. He wasn't going to use it. He was going to drown me in his belly. His meaty hands gripped my shoulders. I was dizzy with mint. My nose sank into his belly, and suddenly I was loose. I had yanked myself out of the shoe he had pumped to the ground, and now I was running, bouncing off people. Pete, come here, buddy. When it was safe to stop, I sat on the curb. I had foiled Bufo again. I was alive. I took to the other shoe and threw it away. It was spring. Then the cold came back. When the cold came back, I would steal another pair. That night on the rug, I laughed as I told the other boys about my close call with Bufo. Yuri did not laugh. He said, "Don't." "Don't what?" I said. "Don't bait Bufo." "Why?" I said. He smacked me hard 3 times. "Don't," he repeated. The rest of the boys were silent. I turned away and whimpered to myself to sleep. I never mentioned the man who could not have been... I turned away and whimpered myself to sleep. I never mentioned the man who could not have been Himmler. Chapter 24. Come here, Petey. Come here. It's my puppy dog, sorry. All right, chapter 24. Find the cow. Find the cow, Dr. Korkut said. It was the only time Dr. Korkut was ever stern with me. Whenever I brought him food for the orphans on the other side of the wall, he received it happily and patted me on the head and said, "My little smuggler." And as I turned to go, he never failed to say, "Be careful." Then one day he added, "Find the cow." From then on, every time I saw him, find the cow. The cow had become something to believe in or not to believe in, like angels, mothers, oranges. How could something as large as a cow live in the ghetto and not be seen? Come here, Petey. Come here, baby. Come here. Sorry. Let's see. How could something as large as a cow live in the ghetto and not be seen? How could it survive? What would it eat? Rubble dust? And yet so great was the cry for milk for children that the cow seemed to materialize from the very hunger of the people, until one could almost see the animal loping down the street. Of course, no one really did see it, and the more we did not see it, the more we believed in it. Almost every day, someone claimed to have heard a mysterious moo. Of course, the day soon came when Janina said she heard it. "No, you didn't," I said, just to be contrary. Janina was always making things up. "I did," she said. "We were playing pickup sticks." She swept the sticks away. "You're being a baby," I said. "You're being a poop," she said. Uncle Shepsill looked up in the book he was reading and growled at Janina. "There's no cow." Reading the new book he had found was all Uncle Shepsill did these days. When he reached the end of the book, he went back to the first page and started again. He muttered under his breath as he read. It was a book about Lutherans. He was teaching himself to be one. Then he was no longer to be a Jew, and that would let him out of the ghetto. Mr. Milgram told him, "You cannot stop being a Jew." Uncle Shepsill said, "I already stopped. I'm a Lutheran." When Uncle Shepsill growled at Janina, there was no cow. I switched to her side. "Yes, there is," I said. "I heard it too." Until then, I had been uncertain. From that moment on, I believed in the cow. I had done this before. It seemed I believed whatever I heard myself say. A few days later, when Dr. Korkut first said, "Find the cow," my belief was confirmed. I could not find the cow. I looked all over. Courtyards, backyards, cellars, rubble, no cow, no moo. "I can't find the cow," I complained to the boys one day. "That's because there is no cow, stupid," said Enos. Big Henrik bellowed, "No cow." Kuba climbed up Big Henrik and sat on one of his shoulders. "I'll bet Big Henrik is lying," he said. Kuba leaned down so his face was upside down in front of Big Henrik's. "Big Henrik, do you believe there's a cow?" Big Henrik swayed under the weight of Kuba. "Yes," he said. We all laughed because we knew his answer proved nothing. Big Henrik was not only the biggest boy, but also the most agreeable. He said yes to everything. This was our signal to play Big Henrik's game. "Big Henrik, do you believe you're the biggest, dumbest person in the whole wide world?" "Yes." "Big Henrik, do you believe you're a little itty-bitty baby?" "Yes." "Big Henrik, are we going to sleep in a castle tonight in big soft beds and eat all the chocolates we want, and the jackboots will be our servants?" "Yes." "Ask him if he believes in Bufo," said Enos, "or Himmler. Big Henrik, do you believe in Himmler?" I butted in. "I don't," I said. "There's no Himmler." As I told them at last about the parade and the magnificent cars and how I called Himmler's name, and the only one who turned out was a chicken-looking man in the front seat, turning one eye to stare at me behind the eyeglass. "That was Himmler," said Yuri. "He can't be," I said. "He looks like my Uncle Shepsel." "It's him," said Yuri. So Himmler, number 2 jackboot, master of all Jews, not to mention Gypsy, was a one-eyed chicken. At that moment, I began losing respect for the jackboots. I no longer wanted to be one. And that wraps up chapter 24. So we'll pick up next week in chapter 25. I hope you guys have a great week, and I look forward to reading for you next week. Bye, guys.